Hey friend, in this video we are going to talk about how songwriting is a funnel, and I'm going to explain what that means to us as songwriters and how we can use the knowledge that songwriting is overall a funnel to our advantage when we are songwriting. And of course, in order to do that, we have to cover what really is this songwriting funnel that I speak of. So let's talk about it. So the first thing we need to talk about here is why are we calling it a songwriting funnel? A funnel is very wide at the top and has its largest circumference at the top, but it actually gets smaller and smaller as you get lower and lower down the funnel until at the other end, at the bottom of the funnel, is actually fairly narrow. So just like a funnel gets narrower as you get farther and farther down it, in the same way, the amount of creative room we have as songwriters as we continue to write our song gets narrower and narrower. So at the beginning, there are just no constraints. There's no key selected that constrains the chords we can use and the notes that we can use for our melody. There is no melody yet, which would constrain what lyrics we can write based on the amount of syllables lining up with how many notes there are in the melody. We can write whatever bass line we want because there are no chords in order to constrain that bass line, which is getting a little more specific, but just to give you an idea of the different constraints that we have at play here. But each creative decision that we make constrains us a little bit more and brings us farther down the funnel where we have less and less creative room or creative circumference. So for example, let's say we start writing our song in the key of E major. Once we choose to write a song in the key of E major, we've now constrained ourselves to mostly using the notes E, F sharp, G sharp, A, B, C sharp, and D sharp, because those are the notes that are contained in E major. Also, choosing E major constrains us to having the note E and the chord E major as our center of gravity for the song. So then if the first chord we have in our song is an E major chord, that somewhat constrains the melody, because if you have an E major chord, you're probably not going to have a melody over it that just contains the notes F sharp, A, and C sharp, because your chord, E major, has E, G sharp, and B. And while you don't want every note of your melody to contain notes that are in your chord, you do want at least some of the notes to come from your chord most of the time. And yes, of course you can have notes and chords that are outside of the context of the key, but those tend to be relatively rare. Sometimes you throw one or two in per song, but most songs, even the vast majority of songs, don't use any notes or any chords that are outside of the key. And either way, the vast majority of the music you write probably will be within the key that you've chosen. So then let's say you start writing the melody, which of course was already constrained by, in our example, the fact that we started with an E major chord. So let's say that the melody you come up with over this E major chord is a melody that consists of 6 notes in the phrase. So if you have a phrase that's 6 notes, you're probably not going to have a lyrical line that matches up with it that's going to have 10 syllables, because then you have 4 extra syllables than you have actual notes. So unless you elongate every single word really awkwardly, you probably aren't going to be able to naturally fit in 10 syllables to a 6-note melodic phrase. And not only that, but the natural emphases of the melody should match up with a good natural emphases of the lyrics, because you don't want to be emphasizing the words and the and other words that aren't super meaningful. You want to be emphasizing the words that need to be emphasized. An example I like to go to when talking about this is the different versions of I love you that we can say, because this is really basic. So if I say I love you versus I love you versus I love you, those all mean different things. I love you is like the answer to the question, who loves me? I love you. And then we have I love you, right? So that's more the answer to the question, well, how do you feel about me? And then there's I love you, right? Which is also a different connotation, right? Who do you love? I love you. You didn't know this whole time? So to keep it simple and stay with this example, if what I'm really trying to say in the song is I love you, then you needs to be something that's emphasized in the melody as well, so that that emphasis comes out in the song. So there's different ways to do this, right? It might be the high note of the musical phrase, or it might be just a note that's held out longer. There are different ways to emphasize notes, but we are going to be somewhat constrained by the fact that once we decide we're going to say, I love you, that somewhat constrains how we write our melody. Or depending on the melody that we already wrote, that's going to do the opposite and actually constrain the lyrics that we can write to fit into that melody. We just kept it simple here, and yet you can probably already see how songwriting is a funnel. With each decision, we have less and less creative room, and it informs what the options we have for the next decision are. Once you have a certain chord, once you have a certain chord progression, you can only do certain things with the bass line. You're somewhat limited. Once you choose a key, you're somewhat limited in your melody and in your chords. No matter what we're talking about in songwriting, each decision you make is going to constrain the next decisions to be somewhat more limited than they would have been if you hadn't written the previous part. So what do we do with this information? In my opinion, the main thing to do with this information is to make sure that we are generally writing the most important parts of our song earlier in the process rather than later. So for example, I would argue that most of the time people don't notice chord progressions or care about chord progressions. I think a good chord progression is great, but at the end of the day, if we're going to compare it to, say, the importance of a great melody, specifically a vocal melody, or maybe a great bass line, or a really cool piano hook, or a great guitar lead part, I think all of those things are going to stand out and be much more important to a song than the chord progression that probably most people aren't even going to notice. And in fact, most of the time when people notice chord progressions, it's usually not for a good reason unless they're a real music theory nerd. But for most people, they only notice chord progressions when it's something like, oh, isn't that the chord progression from that Access is Awesome song? Haha, they used the same old chord progression everybody else did. And that's really not the reaction that you want, and that's not the one time you want people to notice your chord progression. And yet a lot of times I notice songwriters tend to start with just a chord progression, and I think that instead it would be better to maybe start with writing a hook for your song or the melody for your song instead. Now what I'm not saying is that we can never start with the chord progression. Of course you can start with the chord progression. Just know that if you're using up your biggest amount of creative room on a chord progression, that maybe doesn't matter to you quite as much as, say, having a great melody does, or having a great piano hook or a great guitar riff, then maybe you should write those things first instead. And I've talked about this before, but the main way to show that you prioritize something in life or in songwriting or in anything at all is basically two things: how early you do it and how much time you spend on it, right? So when you think about what you prioritize in life, you think about the things you spend the most time on and the things you do first, right? If the first thing you do in the morning is talk to your spouse and ask them how they are, that is showing priority, right? You're saying, before I get to my workout, before I get to my day job, before I get to whatever else I'm going to do with my day, I'm going to make sure my spouse is doing well. But another way to show that you care is to spend a good amount of time, right? So really, those are the two ways to show priority. And I think that's important to take into our songwriting. For example, we'll take me, the things that I treasure the most in songs tend to be either the piano or guitar part, but usually in my case, I do piano riffs first and foremost because I'm more of a pianist than a guitarist, and I frankly just like the piano better. I'm better at writing on the piano, so that is usually my go-to. So I try to write a memorable piano part or piano riff, piano hook first, because I find that that is something that once I write anything else in the song, it's hard to go back and write a pretty good piano part. So I tend to start with that most of the time. And then from there, I write the melody, because the melody is the other really, really important part. And it's not like every single decision we make, you're going exactly in the order of priority. So for example, I think that the melody is probably the most important part of the song, and then lyrics are number 2, with the piano hook being probably number 3 for me. And yet I write the piano hook first. Why? Because I find that the piano hook requires more creative room than a melody and than lyrics, which brings us up to lyrics, which is the only one of the 3 most important parts of a song for me personally that I haven't talked about yet. I actually tend to save lyrics towards the end. But how do I make up for it and still show that I prioritize lyrics? I spend a lot of time on lyrics. In fact, it's not uncommon for me to spend probably 4 times as much time just on the lyrics than I did writing the entire music of the song, because I want to prioritize lyrics. So as you're going through your songwriting, think through, okay, how can I try to make sure I write a good, for example, bass line in this song? A great way to do that is to actually just start with writing the bass line. If you're a pianist, you can go to a piano and just do a bass line on the piano, right? If you're a guitarist and you don't even have a bass, that's fine. You can just use the bottom E string on your guitar and write the bass line. You don't have to actually be a bass guitarist to write the bass line first. You don't have to be a pianist to write the piano part first. So be thinking about in your songwriting, if you are saying to yourself, hey, you know what? On this song, I really want to write a killer, for example, guitar hook. All right, then maybe think to yourself, that's the thing that you want to start with. Make sure you have that killer guitar hook and then figure out the melody on top of that. And then maybe later you spend extra time on the other parts you really want to prioritize in your song to make sure to get it right. Also note for yourself what things more creative room really helps with and what things you can just spend more time on in order to get right. So for example, for me, part of the reason I moved away from doing lyrics first is I find that I end up having about equally good lyrics, and it still takes me a ton of time whether I do them first or last. So that's why I just do them last, because I find that at the end of the day, they're going to be just about as good regardless of which way I go. And either way, it's going to take me forever to get them right to the standard that I want. So I leave it till last. But on the other hand, I think it would take me forever to come up with a piano hook that I really liked if I save that for last. But when I do it first, it actually comes fairly quickly most of the time. So I do that early in the process. That way I can get that done and then move on to other parts. And the last thing of note here is sometimes constraints actually can help creativity. So make sure to change up what order you write different parts in your song. Maybe start with the chorus for some songs, start with verses in others, start with a piano hook or a guitar hook in one, and then start with a bass line in another, and see the results that you get and try to figure out what different orders work best for you. Something I think is really important to point out is that sometimes constraints actually help creativity. It's that whole blank canvas effect. If you just stare at a blank page, sometimes that's just really overwhelming, and then it's actually hard to be creative because you have no constraints at all. So try to figure out as you get into songwriting and as you songwrite more and more, and maybe try this songwriting funnel concept or try implementing the idea of it. As you're doing that, really think through, okay, what parts do I actually benefit from constraints versus what parts do constraints really destroy the creativity very quickly? So again, going back to, for me, for example, I find that if I don't do the piano riff really early in the process, it's really hard for me to get that right. I really need the huge creative room for that. Whereas for lyrics, I really don't need that as much. And I think actually it might even help me, the constraints of having the melody already written, because now I know, okay, I gotta fit the syllables into this. It already has certain emphases to the words. It already has a rhythm that needs to be in the lyrics. That helps make it so that it's easier for me to plug and play words and really workshop the lyrics. So hopefully you found this helpful, and if you did, something else you'll probably find helpful is my free guide on the 10 different ways to start writing a song. This, of course, is not a comprehensive list, but it is meant to give you an idea of 10 different places to start a song from. Don't always start songs with the chord progression, for example. We actually talked about that in this video. That will be really creatively limiting, and eventually you might find yourself sort of trying to figure out, why is it that I feel like my creativity just ran out? And you sit there with your guitar and you think to yourself, I just don't know what to do. I'm so sick of this G chord. I'm so sick of this E major chord. You don't want to be stuck in that position. A great way to do that is to change up how you start songs. So for me, for example, I really like to start some songs with being like, you know what? I want to write a killer bass line. So I'm going to start with that. Sometimes I start with piano, sometimes I start with guitar, sometimes I start with lyrical concepts or thinking philosophically and trying to come up with images that I like and symbolism that I like. So starting from different standpoints can be really helpful. So if you're interested in that, be sure to check it out. I talk about 5 different ways from a lyrical standpoint if you are more of a lyrics first person, and 5 ways from a music first standpoint, because you know what? Both of those are super legitimate ways to start writing a song. In fact, I used to be religiously lyrics first, to the point that I wrote the entire lyrics before I wrote a single note for the song, whereas now I'm sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum, where I actually now prefer to write the music almost completely before I start writing the lyrics. But sometimes I might just write the entire music for, say, just a chorus, and then write the lyrics, and then write the entire music for a verse, and then write the lyrics. But regardless of how you like to songwrite, there should be a ton of different ways for you to start writing a song in this guide, so be sure to check that out. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. I'll talk to you in the next one.